Welcome everybody to the seminar series of the Center for Advanced Studies on Southeastern Europe of the University of Rijeka. My name is Tena Prelec. I'm a fellow of the center and I will be chairing the discussion today. It gives me a great pleasure to welcome today a dear colleague and a mentor, Professor John Heathershaw of the University of Exeter. John and I have been working together since autumn 2019, more or less, when I joined the team of a project under John's leadership. And this project was back then called the Testing and Evidencing Compliance with Beneficial Ownership Checks, meaning it was trying to understand what goes wrong in the due diligence process in Western countries when trying to assess and check money coming from politically exposed persons or from kleptocracies to avoid money laundering. I think it's fair that in the meantime, in this past 2+ years, the project has evolved beyond that, beyond this mere beneficial ownership checks. And as a team, we've really tackled a wide range of topics and issues concerning this transnational universe inhabited by the so-called enablers of corruption in a wide array of issues concerning money laundering and reputation laundering, and touching upon banks, real estate, charities, universities, and philanthropic donations, etc., etc. It's also really great to see that it has spurred quite a lot of policy debate in the UK, and especially on the wings of a recent report, which our team has published recently with Chatham House, and I'll put a link in the chat. So it's really good to see that, well, at least for some, very timely political reasons, i.e. the situation in Eastern Europe and in Ukraine especially, there are talks right now about kleptocracy, about how to sanction these people and how to really address this problem of the enablers that very much is present in the UK and in the Western world more widely. So aside from being a professor of international relations at the University of Exeter, John is also a senior fellow of the British Academy in 2021-2022, where he's studying the relations between Eurasian kleptocratic elites, so he's one of the foremost experts on Central Asia, and British professional service providers, meaning he's really now taking forward our joint work and also building on it and conceptualizing it, etc., etc. And I'm personally really interested to hear the talk today, which is based on this work, and it's titled British Professional Services, Eurasian Elites, and the Transformation of International Security in the Post-Cold War Era. Just a few housekeeping points before moving on to the presentation. So this talk will be recorded. So John's presentation will be recorded and will be available online later on. However, we decided to keep the questions and answers after the talk under Chatham House rules to be freer. So they will not be recorded. So you do not need to be self-conscious about what you ask and what you discuss, because it will stay among us. About the way you ask your questions, feel free to either raise your hand and ask them yourself, or to also write your questions in the chat and I can read them out for you. John will now speak for about 40 minutes and we will then have a good half hour for the questions and answers. Without further ado, John, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Tena. It's a pleasure. The project that we've been working on together, Tena and also Alexander Cooley, longtime colleague of mine, David Lewis at Exeter, Tom Main, Jason Sharman, Casey, Michelle, and Ricardo Suarez de Oliveira, Tena's colleague at Oxford. I have to remember I haven't forgotten anyone. We've been working together as a large team, and it brings together kind of research that some of us have been working on for a long time. In fact, all of us have been involved in this for a long time. So I'm going to kind of try and pull some sort of threads together before the project and during the project. Tena's worked on quite a bit of this research actually, but there are also elements which she hasn't. So it's a kind of synthetic attempt to sort of bring things together. So it's a privilege to be here. It's great to discuss these things with you. And I suppose the core theme, although the project was framed in terms of beneficial ownership because the British government that was funding it had a sort of a technical anti-corruption question around, can you assess beneficial ownership? We were always interested in broader terms, And the kind of thematic in the anti-corruption evidence program where we sit is international architecture. And I prefer that term because it allows us to look at beneficial ownership, sources of wealth, but more significantly, the geography and the space of kleptocracy. And I think that will be the sort of focal point of what I'm going to say this morning. Or lunchtime as it is for you guys in Rijeka. So I thought we would start with a film, which is a short film that we commissioned at the end of our project. The project actually ended at the end of November of last year. And the reason we commissioned it was partly simply because the pandemic had meant that we had lots of funds left over because we couldn't travel and host the events we'd like to. And so we did various things with that funding. And one of them was fund this film. It's a 3-minute film, which sort of brings together the some of the big policy and public interest takeaways from the project. So I'm going to share my screen and start that now. When I begin the film, it's quite an abrupt start. So because they had to fit it into 3 minutes to meet our budget, and that meant it's got a bit more pace than you might normally get. There's no real preamble. Okay, here we go. Hope you can see that and the audio comes across well.
London is a prime destination for corrupt government officials from low-income countries looking to hide their ill-gotten wealth and bypass global anti-money laundering rules. After they've stripped their countries of valuable resources, a hidden system of enablers allows these kleptocrats to launder their money and whitewash their reputations, often without consequences. According to research from the Global Integrity Anti-Corruption Evidence Program, which brings together academic research from around the world, these enablers cover a wide range of professional capabilities. Some are actively complicit, while others are passively negligent. Bankers and other financial service providers set up private accounts and shell companies that conceal their origins. Even reputable financial institutions do not assess actual risks of money laundering from clients associated with authoritarian regimes and terrorist financing. Them anonymously stash their suspicious wealth in luxury property. For example, between 5 and 2000, agents helped high-risk clients from Kazakhstan buy over £500 million of luxury property in London via offshore companies. Universities and foundations accept their donations in secret and often without robust checks into their origins, potentially allowing kleptocrats to buy influence and prestige. Just 7 out of 24 elite UK Russell Group universities report having independent gift committees and public ethics criteria, while none publish details of donations. Enablers open the gates to corruption and facilitate capital flight from some of the world's poorest nations. Lax laws and enforcement, inadequate resources, and limited oversight make this all possible. Policy changes can help fight this corruption. We need better funding of the UK's National Crime Agency with a clear mandate to investigate and prosecute enablers of corruption. Enablers who look the other way by failing to report money laundering suspicions should also face punishment and fines. Lastly, we need a specific legal requirement for universities to report the donor identities and the purpose of donations. The UK cannot stop kleptocratic regimes from stealing their people's money, but we can better regulate the professional enablers who help them become global elites. To learn more about this research and ways you can help, visit ace.globalintegrity.org.
Okay, that was made by Why Not Films, and maybe actually I'll just copy and put in the chat now the link in case you did want to use it in teaching or anything. Very welcome. It's completely free to use. I'm just going to bring up some slides now. Okay, can everyone see those? Yeah, great. All right, so yeah, I'm a fellow at the British Academy for this year. That doesn't mean I'm one of these elected fellows at the British Academy. It's a fellowship that has allowed me to take time out to bring the threads of our project together and do things like the very intense work on the Chatham House paper that Tiena mentioned earlier. I'm actually a fellow in the name of Saki Ruth Dockrell, who's an academic and contemporary historian of Europe and Eurasia. So she was really interested in the emergence of European security relations over the last 30 or 50 years. She passed away a few years ago, and as part of a bequest in her will, this fellowship was created. I think I'm the first holder of the fellowship. And this talk very much is that kind of contemporary security. So it really picks up in the 1980s and says, how did we get here? And rather than the kind of classic transitional question, which was, how do you get from autocracy to democracy? The kind of pathway we're charting really, which is in hindsight, in retrospect, but nevertheless, it's a sort of pathway of transition, I suppose, is one from one type of autocracy to another. Now that in the parts of the former Soviet Union where I work, Central Asia, that we have variants of autocracy, and across the sort of 12 former Soviet republics, not including the Baltic states, that's more or less the case. And so the forms of autocracy moving from and to are, a sort of state socialist one, obviously, of the Soviet Union, to a kleptocratic form. And that is the kind of question we're sort of addressing, or I'm addressing in this talk specifically. But I think the whole team of those of us working on the former Soviet Union are particularly interested in is this transition towards kleptocracy. And this has implications for everything I'm going to suggest to you, including international security in the post-Cold War era. Okay, there we go. It's working. Great. So for me, this has been an emergence of research pathways and trajectories. I mentioned the team before, but this comes together from a book that Alex Cooley and I worked on Central Asia, Dictators Without Borders, some work on conflict and conflict management with David and Nick McGoran, but also Catherine Owen and Shea Bekjuraev, and work on sort of extraterritorial security with Saipira Furstenberg and Ed Lemon in particular. So each time trying to think transnationally about space, trying to think about connections between the states of the former Soviet space, which we're trying to explain their trajectories over this sort of 30-year period. But then there's sort of connections through private sector actors, often non-state actors, and how that reconfiguration of space has changed them as polities. So, the familiar case is one of the first cases I worked on. It's coming out of my PhD research on the civil war in Tajikistan, where it became apparent to me that part of the reason for the way it ended in the way that it did was these kind of global connections. And there's a very complicated map there in front of you. That's actually, believe it or not, an extreme simplification of the nature of the political economy relations of the Tajik Aluminium Company, which is the biggest industrial asset in Tajikistan and responsible for about 40% of its foreign currency earnings. And so if you wanted to understand how the civil war ended, you needed to understand how the regime acquired full and complete control over this major industrial asset. And it did so through a whole series of connections, and a couple that I've sort of focused on there would be offshore bank accounts in the British Virgin Islands, a alumina supply relationship, what's called a tolling relationship, actually, which was linked to the offshore companies through Norsk Hydro, but there was also links with Rusal and Glencore in Switzerland, some American companies too. And it's across all of this, there were a variety of professional service providers involved. The net effect of this was that eventually the regime did gain control of the aluminium smelter, and it accrued something like $2 billion, which is close to a quarter of Tajikistan's GDP in offshore accounts, which we know were being used by the regime for a variety of public and private purposes, from actually genuine public purposes like reforming and modernizing the aluminium smelter, because it's a state-owned enterprise, so you could clearly justify that, through to financing the shopping trips of the president's wife. And this was a kind of offshore slush fund which could be used for a variety of things. But the question is, how did all this happen, and how do we even know about this? Well, we know about this mainly through London Court of Arbitration documents, one of the most expensive cases in English legal history, in excess of $150 million to litigate. And we also know a great deal about the fact that it was British financial service providers or financial services providers connected to London that were involved in many of these deals. So it seemed to me that British financial services were a key part of explaining how the civil war in Tajikistan ended. And that's a realization I came to, I think, after I did my PhD and published a book on this. But it led me to seek to do more research. So that's one case. Second, how did Kazakhstan eradicate its opposition? So this is some of the Exiles database work that Saipira, Ed, and I did. And Kazakhstan did have opposition groups in the 90s, and basically they've been progressively pushed out of the country. So they've been pushed out, they've been offshored, if you like. But eradication is a different matter, and they haven't been fully eradicated because there are opposition figures like Akajan Khashoggi in exile and Mukhtar Ablyazov too. But this big group, which is I think the most significant of the exiled opposition movements, Mukhtar Ablyazov's network, was, I think, deeply suppressed and affected by the fact that over the period from about 2009 to 2016 in particular, there was a concerted state campaign by Kazakhstan to repress them and to basically to restrict their space overseas. And this took place transnationally. It wasn't mainly through foreign state allies. It wasn't that these countries you see on the map. It was in the case of perhaps the Russian case there, but in the other ones, Poland, Czech, Italy, Spain, France, UK, it's not really state authorities. A little bit of evidence actually in Italy it was because of Silvio Berlusconi's relationship to Nursultan Nazarbayev. We could talk a little bit about that later, but by and large, it's a series of legal and professional services being offered to the Kazakhs, which enabled them to track down. And in some cases that meant just freezing assets, getting some of these exiles and Ablyazov himself in difficult legal positions. Ablyazov had asylum in the UK, but lost it because he perjured himself in the courts, partly due to the legal struggles he was involved in. But again, crucial here was a series of professional services, legal, but also quite interestingly, private intelligence, public relations and security companies. So tracking all these individuals through private intelligence and security companies, public relations, a defamation campaign essentially against Ablyazov. And yeah, just the story really, which is very transnational and involves these sort of non-state actors in magnifying Kazakh state power and the nature of the regime. So I'd probably go further and say, can we think about the current crisis between Russia and Ukraine in these terms? I'm not a Russia expert and I'm not going to say too much here, but I'm afraid I don't buy it that this is about NATO expansion. I think it's much more about geoeconomics. I think it's much more, if you think about the 2014 crisis really began with the possibility of EU partnership for Ukraine. I think it's about decoupling Ukraine from a kind of post-Soviet model of economy where these kleptocratic business links determine their nature of their economic relations. And that decoupling is a huge threat. But the complicated thing, of course, is that it's not just Ukraine that is coupled with Russia in that sense. London or Londongrad, as it's sometimes known in popular culture, is deeply connected to Russia too. So hence sanctions, which are rightly, I think, approached with a degree of skepticism because they don't have a great track record. Nevertheless, if sanctions achieve a certain amount of decoupling between Russia and London, and if the specific actions against corporate entities from Russia, possibly the non-opening of Nord Stream 2, various other economic measures, these are the kind of things I think over the longer term could transform the nature of Russia's relationship with Ukraine and with Europe as a whole, actually. And so for me, it is much more geoeconomics than geopolitics in that sense. And it's primarily therefore about a series of transnational relations with a mix of state, but really, really importantly, non-state and private sector actors, including the elites themselves, who have a set of private enrichments, which are private interests, which are primarily about their personal enrichment. Okay, so in terms of research questions, I think this leads us to this, and it's partly coming out of that earlier work, particularly, some of the criticism we got of Dictators Without Borders. It was generally a very well-received book, but we were really being told by reviewers, I think, to focus more on the private sector and non-state actors within liberal democracies. And also the fact that what we were talking about with respect to the former Soviet Union, and not Central Asia in particular, was present in other regions, Gulf, Africa, China, many other cases actually. So the question we come to then is, what is the global social context for the insertion of authoritarian elites into the liberal international order? Global social here being primarily economic, but also a series of social relations, particularly around elite reputations, which I'll get to. So the way we came at this in terms of the literature is thinking about the late socialist and post-Soviet elite as a form of uncivil society. And whereas, in some countries of Central Eastern Europe, there were real strong political struggles of the kind of lustration in the Czech Republic or other places. Most of the Central Asian states, former Soviet states, you had a continuity of the elite. Some places there was real struggle, but even where you had figures like Askar Akayev in Kyrgyzstan, who was a new figure, was involved with Andrei Sakharov and in the People's Assembly in the late Soviet period. Nevertheless, these are people emerging out of the late Soviet elites, which Stephen Kotkin in his more recent book called Uncivil Society. So we're interested in thinking about them transnationally. How do these people go from being, figures within the Soviet Union, so national in that sense, or Soviet at least, to being transnational uncivil society figures? And then what does this tell us then about the way we're thinking about transnationalism and about transnational relations? And perhaps one of the most prominent ways we've thought about that in the literature since the 90s has been prompted by Margaret Keck and Catherine Sicking's work, Activists Beyond Borders, which is saying, well, the transnational is a way to hold these new elites to account. It's a way to expose their human rights abuses. It's a way to provide even maybe for more open economies, although that's not something they really look at in that work. But they're focused on activists, advocacy networks, and a really powerful argument that obviously got a lot of interest in the academic literature. So we say, well, thinking about these two poles, if you like, we can come up with a concept, and that's what particularly Ricardo and Alex and I have done in a paper which is currently under review of transnational uncivil society networks. And we could define these of global networks as global networks that elites, family members, and regime allies forge in order to consolidate their domestic political power and launder their monies and reputations overseas. Crucially, as I'll come to, these involve enablers, and they are a key focus, therefore, of this. So I'm not going to go through all of this because but this is from the paper that we've currently got under review. So the top there is transnational activism of the Keck and Sicking kind. And you've got the actors, the mechanisms, their practices, the spatial politics, and the effects that are supposed in that approach. Now, we would call this an outside-in process. That is, the idea is, as Keck and Sicking call it, you get this spiral model where you kind of get back and forth of things occurring in the domestic, but then getting into outside spaces and being critiqued, being challenged. And there's this kind of what they call a boomerang effect, where, you know, a case goes out into global sphere, it creates a certain amount of shaming, it creates a response from liberal actors, and therefore there is an opportunity for accountability because transnational activists are generating that through their practices. So this means there you have a spatial politics where sort of in a way non-state spaces are being created within autocracies, spaces for activism, spaces to challenge national governance transnationally, and hence national sovereignty is being challenged. But through transnational uncivil society, we can look at a process which, let's say, is more inside out and involves different types of actors, including private sectors, intermediary and agents. Now this, theoretically, we could frame a little bit more as a transnational clientelism. Now this is taken from Jana Honka, a good friend of mine, a piece in Security Dialogue from a few years ago, which she defines as the discharging of order making to brokers and intermediaries via an asymmetric distribution of benefits and cooptation, according to a clientelistic logic. So it's a set of relationships between elites and enablers. So the enablers can help the elites to do certain things to create space for those elites in democracies. And the net effect then, or the putative effect, is the creation of globalized elites. Now, this is a kind of stylized distinction, but I think it helps us get at the big difference here. Importantly, at the bottom line for transnational and civil society, there is much more of a focus on non-state actors and non-state effects. So we're much more interested in the elites rather than the state. To a certain extent, we're interested in the regime, but that's secondary, I think, to the elites themselves and what they're able to do for their own personal reputations and secondarily national reputations, which then might allow them to gain a kudos and a repute for themselves as individuals. So it's quite a different way of approaching this. Okay, so just a little bit more on definitions and research data and methods, and then I'll spend 10 or 15 minutes talking with you about some of the findings. So kleptocracy and grand corruption are sometimes used interchangeably. Kleptocracy is a form of rule. Grand corruption is a function of that rule. I think that's the distinction. We use that definition there from Chris Walker and Melissa Aiton's introduction to a Journal of Democracy special issue, where kleptocracy is a system in which public institutions are used to enable a network of ruling elites to steal public funds for their own private gain. By saying this is transnational kleptocracy, of course, we're extending beyond the national public institutions that are in that definition to say that external actors operating transnationally, very often private sector actors, are involved in that. So there's a need to sort of rewrite that definition. And I suppose without being too grandiose, we're trying to do some of that work inductively from our research to say how you really define transnational kleptocracy. And that's part of a paper actually that Tenna and I are working on that I presented internally at Exeter yesterday. So when we talk about kleptocrats themselves or uncivil elites, I think it's useful to sort of break that down a little bit. That can be people that are in power and their family members and associates. It can be those that are in business, but will be deeply connected to those in power, which we could call oligarchs. And it can be exiles, persons who probably used to be in power, but have since, having made many millions or perhaps more, they've fled the country. But nevertheless should be associated with, I think, the kleptocracy, and that they're a part of this community in exile. I think we can talk about this kind of kleptocracy as having, it's always transnational, as I say, and it has, I think, 3 essential elements. Money laundering is a part of this. I won't define that. I think that's fairly clear. The law around money laundering is much more narrow than maybe the sort of political economy usage of it. So we can talk about that if you want to discuss definitions. Reputation laundering definitely does need a definition. And we defined it in a piece, again, in the Journal of Democracy, that Alex, Jason, and I did a few years ago, as minimizing or obscuring evidence of corruption and authoritarianism in the kleptocrats' home country and rebranding kleptocrats as engaged global citizens. And this crucial element of enablers, or what might be called more politely professional intermediaries, who make these two things, money and reputation laundering, happen. And there's a huge variety of them across various sectors, from real estate agents to lawyers to company formation agents to accountants to auditors, some of whom may be, as we said, actively complicit, as was in the film, and others who may be passively negligent. But they're crucial. There's other things that you could add in here, like explicit authoritarian influencing, explicit acts of repression overseas, but I don't think they're core to the definition. They can happen, but these, for me, would at least be the sort of core elements. It's just a little bit on our data and method. So a lot of the initial work, I think all of us have done, actually. Well, not all of us. Some of us have been doing some major large N studies. But for myself, I think mainly for Tenor too and others, case studies involving process tracing is a key element here. The book I mentioned was dominated by case studies, where you can sort of begin to see how causation works within a case, but it's really, really very hard to generalize from that. And another methods problem, I think, is that there are very few cases that meet a kind of threshold of having enough data that you can do the kind of detailed case study work on them. And we don't really know whether that tip of the iceberg is representative of the iceberg. And you can be clear about your scope conditions, and that helps a lot. But, you know, for many social scientists, working with so few cases to describe such a large phenomenon is itself difficult. So I think there is a need for, at a minimum, descriptive statistics. So here I'm going to present some detail from the wealth report of Knight Frank, which is a big British real estate agent, particularly aiming at high net worth individuals and wealth managers. It's a survey of them to talk about their clients' interests. You can generate a certain amount of data through freedom of information requests, and I'll present a little bit of that too. And then I think methodologically, you can get into qualitative comparative analysis of some of this descriptive statistical data. We're just kind of beginning to do that, really. I'm quite enthusiastic about the possibilities of that, but there are certain challenges of missing data and things that we were talking about yesterday. And if you can go back to the process tracing and do something a little bit more detailed, where you can really follow through on the mechanisms. So you can say, well, there's causality here, but if we want to look at causal mechanisms, we need to go back to the cases. So there's other things we would have liked to do, but the pandemic didn't allow us to do, which we may well get back to, but more or less what I'll present sort of fits across these sort of 3 phases, I think, or 4 phases, really. Okay, so some sort of findings over the last 10 minutes, in addition to the cases I presented earlier. So, you know, this is from the Knight Frank Wealth Reports, this survey of wealth managers. And, you know, we're thinking a little bit about, you know, what's specific to the Russia, Eurasian, post-Soviet region. And one of the things that's at least more acute in that region is extraordinary focus on mobility. This is an elite group which is more transnational than other elite groups. So they're more likely to have second passports or a dual nationality. They're more likely to be considering to acquire it. They're more likely to consider emigrating. And of course, actually across all these groups pretty much, but the UK is one of the top locations. So that UK Eurasian dyad is particularly acute. It's definitely not in itself unique. There are variants and alternatives to it, but it's a particularly strong one. This sort of picking up on a similar theme is about golden visas. Golden visas are something that the UK has offered through something called the Tier 1 investor visa. So this is a route to residency and ultimately citizenship for persons of high net personal wealth. It's interesting, today actually the government has just announced that it is cancelling the Tier 1 scheme. There's a whole backstory to that, where they've held all the visas under review for a period, but there's no possibility of cancelling them because they've given them out to billionaires who have high-powered lawyers who would come back to them, but with any chance. Many of them now are already British citizens. But particularly in this period from 2008 to 2014, they were pretty much given out on a basis of self-regulation. So the lawyers that were filling out the applications for their clients had to do their own checks. So it's basically an entire conflict of interest where you're being paid by a client and then the government expects you to do the due diligence and the checks on these people's backgrounds. So unsurprisingly, they were particularly popular with persons from autocracies, China and Russia being by far the sort of two top applicants over this period of time. So well over half from China and Russia, and a few other sort of top autocracies being very prominent in that list. In fact, if you rank it according to population, that comes across more clearly. I think China drops down because of its size, but Russia and Kazakhstan and Ukraine are still high up there. And as I say, these are all those countries with 50 plus applicants. One thing else interesting to say here is that in this period of time, 93% of applications were accepted. Since then, we know that many of these people have gone on to commit or been found guilty of money laundering offences. There's quite a few anecdotal cases of that, but 93% of them were accepted at a time when about half of asylum applications for persons fleeing armed conflict or poverty were being rejected. So yeah, much easier if you've got a lot of money and can afford to pay for wealthy lawyers to get your settled status in the UK established, unsurprisingly. So second set of trends, that's all about sort of mobility and residency and citizenship. Second set of trends is around property, hugely important here too. And again, the former Soviet Union stands out here in terms of the intention or the action of acquiring investment property abroad. So again, this is an elite which tends to be more transnationalized than other elites. I think here you can see that the Middle East is particularly quite similar. Again, perhaps unsurprisingly, but Russia and the CIS do stand out, particularly in those sort of 71% having investment property abroad. So very transnational elite in terms of property. One of the things we've done, and Tenet's been heavily involved in this, is look at purchases of UK residential property. We've actually been looking at purchases of property in other parts of Europe and the US as well. And we've been looking not just at post-Soviet countries, but African countries. That's the bit that Tenet's been particularly involved in. But Tom Main, our research fellow, has done most of the work on putting together this a database of £2 billion. So what is that? About $2.5 to $3 billion worth of UK real estate bought over around about a 20-year period from the former Soviet republics. Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Russia being the three by far the largest, again linked to their economies, big extraction economies, oil and gas economies. But in many of these cases, family members being or close associates of the president being the key purchasers of properties when you actually look at the beneficial owner of these properties. So sort of big headline figures there about the Azeri, the Kazakh and the Uzbek ruling families essentially buying a large amount of real estate. In the UK, largely in London and the southeast of England. And then when you subject to some analysis, this is just descriptive statistics. We've done some QCA on this too, but I think this is the easiest to present here. We can actually see how, when it comes to the potential actual anti-money laundering cases against some of these properties, we can see that you're only really at risk of losing property if you're in exile. If you're in exile, 87% of you will lose your property. If you're an incumbent, 100% retain the property. So this very much corresponds to an inside-out process where there is an ability of the elites themselves, the incumbent elites, to retain their property overseas, by the provision of exonerating evidence on their behalf, and equally an ability of the same elites to provide incriminating evidence against exiles. So this is, as we argue in the paper that Tena's a co-author on, a instrumental manipulation of an international anti-money laundering system. I could go into a lot more detail on that, but as I say, that's taken from one particular paper. And we think these are quite significant findings. The possible mechanisms there are things, I think the one that I focused on there was the submission of evidence to the courts, but there's some possible other explanations around the procurement of legal services. So I'll maybe just say a little bit more about some cases and then conclude. So this is one which looked like it might be an exception to that general rule I've picked up on around property. This is Dariga Nazarbayeva and her son, Nurali Aliyev, so the daughter and grandson of the former president of Kazakhstan, Nursultan Nazarbayev. We've done a whole long study on this, which will be published next month, but quite an extraordinary story of how what in a way should have been an open and shut case of money laundering was defeated by her lawyers because they were able to acquire evidence from Kazakhstan, which was accepted in the courts, and really made a mockery of a major new British anti-corruption initiative that was announced by the Prime Minister in 2016, but has barely been used because of the effectiveness of enablers at beating back these cases. One which, again, looks like an exception in some ways is because this is here, what we have here is one of the two exiles that were actually able to retain their property overseas. But this isn't because this person had a legitimate right to retain property. This is a person, Maxim Bakiev, the son of the former president of Kyrgyzstan, Kurmanbek Bakiev, who there was an enormous amount of evidence of corruption, several studies, including studies that linked the money that he had acquired through corrupt means in Kyrgyzstan to the property, the £7 million property he bought in Surrey, just outside of London. But nevertheless, he was able to successfully defend himself against the civil case and acquire asylum in the UK, despite all these concerns. And again, effective legal counsel here seems to be significant. The reason for that is that Kyrgyzstan, unlike Kazakhstan or Azerbaijan or Russia, is a relatively poor government who relied on pro bono legal support and didn't have the kind of armies of lawyers that the Kazakh government has. Okay, finally, I'm pretty sure I must be close to running out of time, but philanthropic preferences, so some of that reputation laundering stuff. It's interesting here from the Knight Frank Wealth Report, a lot of emphasis by the sort of new Russian bourgeoisie, post-Soviet bourgeoisie on arts in particular, nothing on social issues, equality and human rights. Again, very low, sort of slightly unusual in terms of philanthropic causes. Maybe hints at a sort of instrumental use of this kind of thing, but there's only so much you can take from descriptive statistics. There are some cases that emphasize how by making an investment to a university, for example, you can have an instrumental purpose. The most famous one perhaps is Dimitrov, the Ukrainian oligarch who made an endowment for a research center on Ukrainian studies at Cambridge. And then the following year brought a libel case against the Kiev Post. So this is a Ukrainian launching a libel case against the Ukrainian newspaper in the UK. And the grounds for doing it in the UK were that he had substantial and important connections to the UK. And one of those, most particularly, was this endowment to Ukrainian studies at Cambridge. Political donations, another area. We talked about this a little bit in the Chatham House report Tena mentioned. So one of the top 10 donors to the Conservative Party in the UK is Lubov Chudnukina, who is someone who got one of those tier 1 investor visas, donated £1.7 million over less than a decade. What does that get you? Well, we know it gets you private dinners with Theresa May when she's Prime Minister, something called a ladies' night with Liz Truss and Theresa May, and tennis matches with Boris Johnson, I think including when he was Prime Minister. What it gets you in terms of influence and being part of the conversation, I'm afraid is hidden from view. But if you've been able to acquire British citizenship through the tier 1 investor route, you're then able to donate because you need to be a British citizen to donate to a political party. So there's a lot going on here. So what I suppose is the kind of the conclusion in a way. I mean, there's been a whole series of books by people we know actually in all three of these cases, mainly by journalists. All of them actually, I think, maybe not Moneyland, but 2 of those 3 have been subject to defamation cases where the elites mentioned have used the UK courts, the English courts, to try and get these publications revised or try and get these publications taken off the shelves. So that's another form of reputation laundering, which we could talk about, but we haven't specifically done research on, although we are always at risk of being subject to it ourselves. And I think what particularly Oliver's book and Tom's book suggests is there is a spatial aspect to this. Moneyland, kleptopia. This is about a set of transnational relations, a new way of thinking about international relations, which requires us to think differently about the relationship between post-Soviet Eurasia and the UK or European states or Western states, but also, you know, Singapore or Dubai and other places which are major financial centers. So we need to think differently, I think, about these relationships, to chart these connections transnationally. And then we need to think carefully about the rule of law. I'll just make a comment on this before concluding. So, you know, in the Chatham House report, we really emphasize the rule of law because it's a good way of communicating these findings into the British public sphere. You can get members of parliament to stand up and say, oh, rule of law is being challenged. But of course, it's not a matter of us having the rule of law and the places where kleptocrats come from not having the rule of law. It's not as simple as that. But if you look at the British situation, where in those cases I've mentioned, the data we have, there is a genuine question about whether the rule of law is accessible, fair and efficient. And that's being raised not just by us, but by, in this case, Stephanie Boyce, who's the president of the Law Society in England, in a piece just a few months ago. And this is part of the reason. And the reason isn't because you've got these bad foreigners who are coming in and exploiting our naive legal professionals. Quite the contrary, it is because those lawyers are providing a set of services into the market. And they're doing that in a way which is extraterritorial and is offensive. This is not simply about providing a defense for elites against money laundering charges. It's providing a set of services to acquire property, to manage reputations, which allow them to insert themselves in the way that we're talking about in transnational and civil society globally and become these transnational elites. So I think the rule of law allows us a way in there because it is important to maintain some distinction between a place where your property and your status is entirely reliant on political position and a place, i.e. London or many other places, where your property and position can be defended legally according to the rule of law. And we know it's really, really difficult to successfully prosecute anti-corruption cases. So just to conclude, really, there are underlying and often enduring transnational networks that we can call post-Soviet kleptocracy in this particular instance, but there are other variants of it for other regions and other dyads, but this is the UK's kleptocracy problem. In descriptive and conceptual terms, we can define these networks as transnational and civil society. I think we know more about their actors, their practices, and their spatial politics. That's what I focused on and what I presented, than about their mechanisms and effects, and that needs theorizing a bit more. We know then about these actors, practices, and spatial politics that laundering reputations and making space via things like second citizenship or golden visas, property purchases, and targeted philanthropy are the goals of these transnational and civil society networks and their enablers. And we can see that these are especially intense for post-Soviet Eurasian elites in the UK. And in a way, I think Eurasian kleptocrats in the UK stand out as a sort of first generation of transnationalizing and laundering wealth and status with the assistance of these private sector enablers. And the servicing of these post-Soviet elites, I think, should be a lesson for us in how we think about international relations conceptually, but also be an alarm bell for us in thinking about how the rule of law is being compromised through these relations. Okay, so I'll stop there, and I'm sure I've gone over time. I apologize for that.
No need to apologize, John. Thank you so much for this absolutely fascinating talk.